speaker, Dr. Njwen Anyangwe-Ngute. Please can we just give a round of standing ovation, yes ma'am? Thank you for that very, very kind and really long introduction. I think you missed my short biography, which I said. Oh, you decided to use this one? Okay, because I was kind of surprised to hear this very long story. You pulled it from the neck here. And I would have to say there is some updated information. I'm no longer with Exponent. Yeah, I'm with a regulatory agency, which I choose not to call the name.
Okay.
But I also teach as an adjunct professor at Howard University. So I'm really, really excited to be here. Honestly, the devil wanted to deal with me. But I'm happy that I'm strong and I'm standing right here.
Amen.
So thank you so much. I always tell people that I'm a Nigerian, you know. I went to school at the University of Port Harcourt. 88 January, had my first degree, went to medical school for 1 month. I couldn't stand cadaver. So I left. But I think because I had a choice to do a master's in biochemistry, so I decided to go do a biochemistry instead of dealing with dead bodies. Sometimes I do regret it though, because they make a lot of money in the United States of America as MDs compared to PhDs. So sometimes I do regret it. I lied. Okay, so I'm looking at Dr. Professor Orish Ebere sitting right here. This is how I got to be our WASOT today. Because I met Dr. Ebere in 2009, if I remember. Right? Yes. When he was the global scholar for the Society of Toxicology. And we were also excited at that meeting to see our African big brother. You know, so we all said we have to attend his lecture. And we all went there, and after that we all rushed to him to greet him and congratulate him, and we went out. And I'm somebody who knows how to keep my connections. So I kept that connection. And 2 years ago, he reached out to me, 2019. And he said, we are having the WASOT 10th anniversary, and I would like to have a female to recommend a female speaker as one of the keynote speakers, and I want to recommend you. And I said, sure, why not? Nigeria is my home.
Yeah.
So I can make it. So I'm here today, and like I said, I have connections everywhere. I have my sister there, and I have my friend. All uniform. They are here to support me. So I decided to give this keynote address today: Toxicology, the past, the present, and the future. We've come a long way as toxicologists. And I always say for me, toxicology is a borrowed field. And I think that happens with many of us here. I'm actually a biochemist, right? And then nutrition, food science, cancer biology. But then I found myself in toxicology. So that's the issue with toxicology. Because most people who do toxicology work are really not trained toxicologists with degrees in toxicology. They happen to find themselves there, and then they get training along the way. And that's what I am. Okay? I'm not a toxicologist by education, but I'm a toxicologist. I hope this is not going in and out, is it? Okay. So I'm a toxicologist because, of course, I wouldn't call the agency because I'm not supposed to do that, but I work for an agency as a regulatory toxicologist. And during that process, I have undergone so many trainings. So I call myself a toxicologist. By education, I'm a biochemist, nutritionist, cancer biologist. Okay? So I'm going to speak today to you about toxicology. What is toxicology? We are all toxicologists in this room. So we are all toxicologists in this room. So we know what the definition of toxicology is. Toxicology is the study of the adverse effects of biological, chemical, physical agents to living organisms and also to the environment, and ways in which we can ameliorate those adverse effects. But we also know that in the past, Toxicology was more the science of poisons. So this definition has really evolved, okay, from that traditional view of toxicology as the science of poisons to what we know now as the study of the adverse effects. Okay, so what is the basic principle of toxicology? It is the dose response. With the father of toxicology, Paracelsus says, the dose makes the poison. Everything is a poison, nothing is a poison. It is the dose that makes the poison. So it is the amount of the substance as well as the duration of the exposure, okay, that would make that substance a poison. Next slide. So everything has the potential to be a poison. Even the things we consume daily. We all drink water, right? But we know that in high quantities, water can also be a problem. Like they say, 1 apple a day keeps you away from the doctor. But of course, an apple contains formaldehyde. But the quantity that you have is like 0.6 grams per kilogram of an apple. That's very minute, so it wouldn't cause problems. Okay, look at pear, for example. Pear has amygdalin. No, pear has formaldehyde, apple has amygdalin, potato has solanine, cucumber has picabidocin. All of these foods, we eat them every day. But they contain these chemicals. If the chemicals are a lot, then we can get into trouble. So everything has the potential to be a poison. Another example is a nutrient. Nutrients at high levels can become toxic. We've heard about iron poisoning in children when they consume so much of it. But iron is a nutrient for blood development, right? Red blood cell development. But with too much of iron, we can get into toxicity. Okay? So the RDA for iron, I'm sure how many people here are nutritionists, toxicologists? Not many, okay. So the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance for iron is 8 grams per day for men and postmenopausal women. It's 18 milligrams per day for premenopausal women. And the tolerable upper intake level, which is similar to your acceptable daily intake for toxicologists, is 45 milligrams per day based on gastrointestinal symptoms. But we've had situations where children have been poisoned by consuming iron. Because if you look at the iron supplements, they look very much like candy. They're all colored. They're sugar-coated, brightly colored. So children can get confused and think it's candy, and they feed on them, so they can have about 10. One of those tablets contains about 19 milligrams of iron. So that puts them way over the tolerable upper intake, so they get into acute poisoning. So this is just an example to really say the concept of the dose makes the poison is for real. Okay? So even a nutrient that's so essential like iron can be toxic at high levels. So there are other factors that determine toxicity. One of them, of course, is the route of exposure. Oral versus dermal versus inhalation. Another is the frequency and duration of exposure. If you sit down and you consume cyanide and so much, of course you're going to die, right? Absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. How is it absorbed? How is it distributed? How is it metabolized? How is it distributed? All of that will influence the toxicity of the compound. And then the characteristics of that subject. So for example, the child, how does that child process? We know there are anatomical, physiological, and biochemical characteristics of the child that will make them metabolize a chemical different from that of an adult. So the age is a factor. Another factor is the gender, female versus male. There are differences in cytochrome P450. There are differences in phase 2 metabolism between women and men that will influence the toxicity. Another thing is race. We know the situation about alcohol. When you look at Caucasians versus Orientals, you have a situation where when Orientals drink alcohol, they flush. They become red because they have a deficiency in the enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase. Okay? So therefore they do not metabolize acetaldehyde. That causes the flushing. So that is a racial difference. So all of this will influence toxicity of a chemical. So what about, can you go one slide back? Okay. So what about body mass index? We all know that being overweight, we saw it with COVID. Sure. Okay, we saw it with COVID. I lost people that were overweight because that's already putting them at a different toxicity level. So those are all things that will influence the toxicity of a chemical, a bacterial agent, whatever agent, virus. Next slide, please. So when we look at toxicology, there are several disciplines of toxicology. We have the descriptive toxicology, we have mechanistic toxicology, regulatory toxicology, which is what I do. We have forensic, clinical, and of course there's veterinary and there's environmental and many other sub-disciplines. So what is descriptive toxicology? This is what I use for my day-to-day work. So descriptive toxicology is the science of toxicity testing to provide information for safety evaluation and regulatory requirements. So that's one discipline of toxicology. The second is mechanistic. So mechanistic is identifying and understanding the cellular, molecular, biochemical basis by which chemicals exert their toxic effects. So basically, how do they exert the toxic effect? How do they interact with tissues to cause toxicity? Next slide, please. Regulatory toxicology is to do with what your NAFDAC people do, right? So if you're trying to market a new drug, you're trying to market a new dietary supplement, for example, you have to have enough data. You submit it to your NAFDAC, for example, and the regulatory toxicologist reviews the data to ensure that that product is safe before it gets into the market. So that's just what regulatory toxicology is. Next slide, please. Clinical toxicology is the study of the toxic or adverse effects of agents such as drugs and chemicals in the body. So it encompasses the expertise in the specialties of medical toxicology, applied toxicology, and clinical poison. And the next is forensic toxicology. So we use forensic toxicology when we are trying to investigate a case, legal case of cause of death, for legal reasons or for medical reasons. So that's forensic toxicology. So moving on to what my topic really is, but I had to give a background, even though I know we are all toxicologists here, because this is West African Society of Toxicology meeting. But then, to be able to get to where I am, I have to review what toxicology is. So in the past, what really was toxicology? Toxicology was viewed as the science of poisons. So it was about identifying toxic compounds, okay, in animals, in insects. So we talk about spider, snake venom, scorpion venom. That's really what toxicology was, prehistorically, right, in the past. And it was also about herbal medicine, the use of medicinal plants to manage disease and treat diseases. And I put a caveat there for obvious reasons. We saw that today with COVID. So many people went back to using their garlic, their ginger, their lemon, barks of trees and boiling them to prevent COVID. I don't know if it happened here. Oh, sure. Because in America, a lot of us Africans went back to prehistoric times to what our forefathers did. So that I put a caveat there, even though it's of the past, but we still do it today. But the difference is that at least now we know what the active ingredient is in some of these herbs, unlike what our forefathers did. Then it was just common knowledge. Oh, my grandmother used to go and pick up the leaf behind the house to treat malaria, right? And then that knowledge is passed down to other people. But now we are sure. Artemisia, right? Moringa, we know what the active ingredient is, so we can tell. So that's the difference. But that's the toxicology of the past. It's the science of poison. Accidental poisoning, it still happens now. That's why I have the asterisk. But it was more so then than now, because now we're a little bit more careful. The incident of iron poisoning I mentioned, it could happen then, but now we have safety laws around supplements so that children cannot easily open them. So there are ways to minimize, mitigate accidental poisoning. Criminal poisoning. Criminal poisoning occurred a lot then. It might occur now, but you've got to be careful because you can be found out. Then you could do it and get away with it, right? Now we have analytical methods that can pick up parts per billion of a poison. If you decide to poison your husband to get his life insurance policy. I'm just kidding. Okay, next slide please. So this is really toxicology of the past. done by women. I'm talking about 16th, 17th century. Okay, so this is an example of a woman called Ilia Topana. She was fond of giving a mixture of nightshade, arsenic, and lead to women to eliminate their husbands. The women were no longer in love with their husbands, or in any case, did not even marry the men because they loved them. So they had to, and then they were unhappy in the marriage. So the only way to do it is to kill the husband so they become widows. So they used this lady quite a bit to get that poison, to poison their husbands. But she ended up killing over 600 men.
Wow, serial killer.
600. But you know, sometimes you think you're smart, you think you can keep doing things, but one day you will. But eventually she was caught, and she was executed in 1659. Another example is a woman called Mary Ann Cotton. She did have not because she didn't like her husband, she did have because she wanted inheritance. She wanted money. So she would take life insurance policy for her husband, married a number of times. She kills you, gets your life insurance, marries the next one, kills, gets the life insurance. And she did that for 3 husbands, her children, up to 8 of her own children. She also did that for a boyfriend and 7 stepchildren.
Wow.
So this is how toxicology was practiced.
Evolved.
Way back then. Criminal poisoning. And then there was a notorious group of women called angel makers in Hungarian history. They also did the same thing. They provided arsenic to women to kill their husbands. And they killed about 300 men. So this is the way people practiced toxicology in the past. Science of poison and also herbal medicine. Next slide, please. So even though I put a caveat there, that even though it happened a lot in the past, but we still see it today. But the difference is we can be caught. If you remember the Ukraine president in the 2004 election, he was poisoned with dioxin, and you can see his face. Okay? So that was dioxin poisoning. And Yasser Arafat also was poisoned with radioactive polonium. The wife reported that to Rogers in 2014, even though he passed away in 2004. So we still have that happening today. But because of the analytical methods, they can easily detect that he was poisoned. Next slide. So, like I already mentioned, science of poisons, herbal medicine. We have our African traditional medicine, you have the Chinese traditional medicine, you have Indian traditional medicine. All of this use herbs, medicinal herbs to treat and manage disease. For me personally, for my master's degree, I worked on the efficacy of 2 herbs. Scoparia dolcis, also known as licorice weed, and Catharanthus rosea, also known as Madagascar periwinkle, in the management of diabetes mellitus. I had a survey, and I went to the teaching hospital at University of Port Harcourt and distributed the survey. And the question was, if you have diabetes, what herbs do you use besides your standard orthodox treatment, which was glibenclamide at the time? So, yes, it was glibenclamide. So, these were the 2 herbs that came up most of the time. People said they use Catharanthus rosea and Scoparia dolcis. So I looked at the efficacy of extracts of these herbs compared to glibenclamide. And sure enough, they were quite effective. Of course, not as effective as glibenclamide were. So again, this just shows you that we have a lot within our African botanical that we can use to treat diseases. So we can take advantage of the herbs that we have and develop products, dietary supplements, drugs, okay? Or we can use the active ingredient and do some libraries and generate drugs faster. So we are really endowed as African toxicologists. So look at how many people eat bitter cola. I don't know if that's what's called in Nigeria. Is that what it's called? Bitter cola is supposed to be what, an aphrodisiac or something?
Sure.
Okay. It helps with gastritis. Like they say, you can increase your sexual power by using that. Aloe vera, of course, we all use aloe vera. My mom has aloe vera all over her compound. If you have a wound, you simply just click through the aloe vera, get the gel, and you use it. And Herbalife in America, that's a company that has made a lot of money from aloe vera. And we are Africans sitting here and not taking advantage to develop products. Okay, but a company in America is using that same aloe vera to make millions, and we are buying them here in Africa and Cameroon for the same reason. So we have to take advantage of what we are endowed with naturally for product development and monetize it. Moringa, that's the last picture there. Moringa is one that we have these days. People use moringa all the time to boost their immunity. Okay, so these are all the ways we used in the past, but now we still use them in the present. But the difference is now we know what the active constituents are. Now we can be clearer to make sure, somebody just presented on heavy metals. We can be clear to make sure they don't contain heavy metals. So there are better ways to do it than our forefathers did. So that is toxicology. The science of poisons, herbal medicine. Moving on to toxicology in the present. So what is toxicology in the present? Now we've gone on to develop methodologies to identify and quantify these toxic substances. But we are doing it in collaboration with analytical chemists. We are also studying the mechanisms of actions of some of these. So it's not just about, oh, this is toxic. How does it exert its toxicity? Also, we are able to now to predict adverse effects. Okay, so you can look at a compound and say, oh, it has an epoxide functional group, and this compound that had an epoxide functional group was neurotoxic. So they have similar structures. So you can predict that this compound, if you don't have enough data, but because this other compound that had the same functional group was neurotoxic, this might be neurotoxic. So we can predict toxicity. Okay. Another one is actually producing antidotes. So it's just not about science of poison. You're also developing drugs. You're developing dietary supplements. You're developing vaccines, you know. And in all of that, we have preclinical data, we have clinical data, that all is toxicology, right? So that's the way we use toxicology today. So how do we apply toxicology? I'm going to speak not as a clinical toxicologist, not as a forensic toxicologist, but more as what I do daily, regulatory. So for safety evaluations, for hazard assessment, is something safe? Is that thing going to be a hazard to human health or environmental health? Let me go back one slide. Okay. Risk assessment. I don't know how many people here are risk assessors. Some of you are risk assessors, yes. So that's another way we use toxicology, right? Combined with exposure assessment to characterize risk. And in drug development. In all of this, we have preclinical data and clinical data. Next slide, please. So, as a toxicologist, when you review data, remember you're trying to review descriptive toxicology data. Most of this data, of course, is animal studies. And animal studies are done to determine, you're trying to make sure is what you're evaluating safe before it can go to the market, for example. So animal studies are done to determine the toxicity. We can do active toxicity study, subchronic for up to 90 days, chronic for up to 6 months to 1 year, cancer bioassay. We have to determine whether it can cause cancer, because if something causes cancer, you don't want it, right? You don't. You also have to determine if it could cause reproductive or developmental issues. A typical example is the incident of thalidomide. How many know about the thalidomide incident? So thalidomide was a drug that was given to pregnant women in Europe to stop morning sickness. It was already approved in Europe, it was in the market, and they were taking it in Europe. But when it came to the United States, there was a pharmacologist at the US FDA called Frances Kelton. She looked at the data and she said, not approving thalidomide in the US. And she did good, because eventually women who took thalidomide in Europe had children who were born with phocomelia, short arms, no fingers, and that was when said you have to test for reproductive toxicity, development, and teratogenicity. So those are some of the studies that we review. Carcinogenicity, of course, it shouldn't induce cancer. And the world is a global village. So we have what we call the OECD guidelines, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They have guidelines for each of the studies that have to be done. Next slide. So these are the guidelines for the studies that we review today in safety assessment, hazard evaluations, whatever that you do. I'm not going to go through the guidelines, but this is the list. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at toxicology data today to assess safety of whatever, dietary supplement, food ingredient, drug, there are things you should be considering. The animal model. Is that the appropriate animal model? The strain, the species. You're looking at the route of exposure. Is it by dermal, oral, or inhalation? If you're trying to market, say, a food ingredient, you're not concerned about dermal toxicity, right? I mean, dermal route of administration. You're concerned about oral route. So that's what you should be looking for. If you're trying to market a cosmetic, then dermal should be the route of administration. So those are the things you consider. You also look at the tested doses. Do they have 3 plus the control? Is the study that's good laboratory practice? Is it GLP or non-GLP? So those are all the considerations as a toxicologist in the present when you do safety assessments. These are the things you consider. You also consider if the data is there and you see statistical significance. Remember the p-value sometimes does not really mean anything, okay? So you have to look at the totality of the data. Biological relevance versus statistical relevance. You look at the concurrent control versus historical control. Is it a rare kind of tumor in the case of a cancer? So there are so many considerations when you're looking at the evaluation of that data to make a decision whether or not some food, chemical, or drug is safe. Next slide, please. So for in vitro studies, like genetic toxicology studies, AIMS-ASI, for example, in vitro micronucleus chromosomal aberration, all those are in vitro. So they help you to determine mechanism, they help you to determine whether or not something is genetically toxic. But then, for this, you cannot determine a Noel. Once it's an in vitro study, we don't determine Noels from them. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, you're trying to really determine whether something is a risk. Okay, so you consider several things. The first thing you consider is the hazard lighting. Is it a hazard? The next is the dose response, which is hazard characterization. And then exposure assessment, because you could really have something that's present, right? And it causes liver toxicity, for example. But if humans are not exposed to that chemical at a dose that would cause the toxicity, then there's really no risk, right? So you consider all of them in your risk assessment. Next slide, please. And at the end, from those toxicology studies, we look at the most sensitive endpoint for the longest duration of study, and we derive what we call the no observed adverse effect level. And then you relate that to safety factors, or what we call unsafety factors, and you get what you call the acceptability tape. And you now compare your exposure to your acceptability, and then now you determine. So these are various ways to determine exposure. Next slide, please. And then at the end, you determine whether or not that thing is safe. And it's not just about the ADI, it's actually the totality of the evidence. You look at the ADI, you look at the mode of action, you look at the human relevancy. So there's so much to be looked at for you to finally come to that conclusion of whether something is safe or not. Okay. So this is the way we use toxicology today, from my perspective. I'm not a forensic or clinical toxicologist, I'm speaking from what I do. Next slide, please. Oh, this is fine. So now you know about toxicology of the past, which was about the science of poisons and about herbal medicine, medicinal plants. Now you know about toxicology of the present, which for me is safety evaluation, hazard assessment, risk assessment, okay, from my standpoint of view. Now let's look at toxicology for the future. There is just a lot of advances in toxicology. And I'll tell you this as I go on to speak, I do not have the expertise in these new approaches. I learn every day. I go to workshops and symposiums. I mean, I attend almost every week. I'm attending like 3 or 4 different seminars to go to learn about this. Because the industry is going so quickly. So we have to adapt ourselves to learn faster, to understand all these new approaches, all these advances in toxicology. But we know that there's a drive towards reducing animal testing. We know there's a drive towards replacing and refining. That's what we call the 3 R's. Replacement, reduction, and refinement. Replacement says you stop using animal tests. Don't use animals anymore. Replace with in vitro methods or other methods. But when it is not possible, then you reduce animal testing. And then refinement means you look for ways around your experimental methods to reduce. But the goal, there are 3 main reasons why we have the 3 R's. 1, for ethical reasons, to reduce suffering and pain to the animals. 2, for practical reasons. And of course for economic reasons. I think about just a single cancer bioacid that can cost a company about $1 million or so dollars. That's a lot of money. And then of course the suffering and pain. You have the animal welfare people. So now there's a push towards reducing in vivo testing to more in vitro methods, computer model. Okay. So that is what it is. So the driving forces, for example, the European Union has the REACH program, Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, Restriction, which promotes alternative methods for hazard assessment of chemicals in order to reduce the number of testing. And for cosmetics now, in Europe, you cannot do any animal testing for cosmetics. So again, we are dealing with a global environment, right? So if you're trying to market a cosmetic that you think will get to Europe, then you have to be careful doing animal toxicity testing. But the downside is you don't have many alternatives. The alternatives are more with short-term acute effects. Tox 21 and Toxicas promoted by the US FDA, those are some of the driving forces for the reduction in animal testing. So this is really the future. Next slide, please. Okay. So what are some of the advances? Some of them are not so new, but that's the direction we are going. We know about the omics, genomics, proteomics, and metabolomics. So are some genes upregulated or downregulated when you induce a chemical? Are some genes, for example, if you have, you give a chemical and you notice that some genes that are tumor suppressor genes, for example, are upregulated, then that might signal something positive, right? Good. But if you have genes that are oncology genes, right? Oncogenic genes that actually get upregulated, then that might signal that it might induce cancer. So those are the things you look at. And then you look at also the proteomics, the proteins. Which ones are upregulated, which ones are downregulated. You look at the metabolites as well. So that's all the omic side of it. I know we are doing it now, so it's not, this one is not really new, but that's the way we're doing it. Computational toxicology. Read across, artificial intelligence, and the big one now is the organ on a chip. Humans on a chip. That is the future. That's the big one. Next slide, please. So what is computational toxicology? It is the use of data and information to develop mathematical or computer-based models to predict adverse health outcomes. Examples would be your quantitative structure-activity relationship, PureSat and SAT. Those are examples. And then you have PPK modeling, physiologically-based pharmacokinetic models. And they're applied for hazard and risk prioritization and for safety screening. Next slide. So this is just what they are. I don't want to spend too much time, but this is what PureSat is. PureSat would determine or predict the physicochemical, biological, and environmental fate properties of compounds from their chemical structure. So it relates quantitative measure of chemical structure to a physical property or a biological activity. PPK is a mathematical model that simulates the concentration of a drug over time in a tissue and blood by taking into account the rate of the drugs at mean. So these are all examples of computational toxicology. Read across is something that is more common with chemicals, with pesticides. So if you go to the European Chemical Agency, you will see quite a number of chemicals. So what you do with read across, you have a compound that is really data rich. There's a lot of data for that compound. Then there's this new compound that is data poor. But you're looking at that compound that is data rich for structural similarities. Do they have the same functional group? Do they have the same carbon chain length, for example? and you can predict the toxicity of this other compound based on that. You can also predict it based on biological similarity. Do they have the same precursor? Do they form the same metabolites? Okay, so you can use that to predict. So that's what we call read across. There are best practices for read across. Artificial intelligence, that's a big one now. Data mining, machine learning to process massive amount of data. It's quite time efficient, robust, and has superior reliability. It has the ability to improve the efficiency of drug discovery and drug development, and it has real opportunities in food ingredient safety in the food industry as well. And then the last of them is the organ on a chip. So this is what is really the big deal now. Every meeting you go to, it's about it. So you can have a single organ on a chip, like a heart, lung. You can have multiple organs, 2 organs. You can have a whole human on a chip. So it's a microsystem. Microscale system used to mimic the human body environment. The goal for organ on a chip is to develop human tissue models for disease modeling and drug testing. It's a tool for extrapolating in vitro cell-based assays towards the in vivo toxicity evaluation. It has promise for advancing the understanding of the mechanism of disease and accelerating drug development. It has the potential to reduce whole animal testing. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture. This is an example of multiple organs at me on this side, and that is the human organ on the chip. You can actually see the human body there. So these are just examples. This is where the future of toxicology is. Next slide, please. So, toxicology, the future. I've shared with you why we have all these new non-animal models to determine whether or not something is safe for drug development, because we have the 3 R's that says we should reduce animal testing. So we have organ on a chip, we have artificial intelligence, we have computational toxicology. But the question really is it ready for prime time? And the answer is no, it's not. And it is not ready because we have limitations. Just like any science thing, we have uncertainties. Okay. Like I asked a question one time when the first time I ever attended a seminar on organ on a chip. I was like, wait a minute. We are human body. We have a heart. We have a kidney. We have a liver. So you process things through the liver, the kidney, right? And then you give me one organ on a chip, the liver. What is interconnectivity when there are no other organs? So those are the limitations. I guess that's why they're developing more and more to now have what we have, like the human on the chip. So those are the limitations. There are limitations, there are uncertainties. So it's not ready for prime time. We have to also validate all of these methods. There must be validation. And it takes a while for validation. So it is not ready for prime time. But the truth is, this is the future of toxicology. This is the future of toxicology. The future is now. The train is moving. We all should get on board that train. So some thoughts to consider for us as African toxicologists. What are some of the thoughts? Are we prepared? Are we prepared to embrace this future of toxicology? Are we? Are we prepared? Okay. So it's a food for thought, right? Let's think about it. Are we prepared? If we do not want to be left behind in the global scene, then we must get onto that train. We must train our new generation of toxicologists in these new approach methodologies. We must train our new generation toxicologists in regulatory toxicology and risk assessment. We must seek resources to help develop in these areas. And I do understand, and I guess that's why there was some reluctance, that there are real challenges, right? There are real challenges, but also there are real opportunities that will make us move forward. So what are some of the challenges that I know? I'm African, I'm from Cameroon, I'm not Nigerian, but we are all the same. So I know there are real challenges. Finances is a challenge. Human capacity is a challenge. Infrastructure is a challenge. Educational resources, networking. Do we have the resources to network with international community? That's a challenge. How many universities, I don't know, do have dedicated programs in toxicology, advanced degree programs? Just one?
Standalone.
Yes. Just one. Oh. So right there, and that's your standard. Because most of them are like under biology. So that's a challenge because we do not have educated departments for just toxicologists. Understand? That's a challenge. Another challenge is how many toxicologists are trained in regulation and safety of newly marketed products? Very little. So that's a challenge. How many are trained in risk assessment? I asked that question, quite a few, right? Are trained in risk assessment. How many faculty members are trained in these new approach methodologies? Zero. Because I'm from the US, but I tell you, when I go there to listen to some talks, it's like magic to me. But I know that as time goes on, I have a better understanding. And truly, I'm in a better place now about, for example, organometry than I were 3 years ago. Okay? So it's something that we all have to be ready to grasp, be ready to seek the resources to help us understand this new approach methodologies. But like I said, there are challenges for Africa, but there are also opportunities for Africa. Like I said, we are well endowed with natural resources. We can make use of those natural resources for product development and making money. We are also in a unique environmental circumstances. Automobile exhaust. The number of yellow, what do you call the yellow cars that I see out there? So we have automobile exhaust, can do research on their effect on human health. Somebody just presented about oil spill. I think Nigeria is blessed with a lot of oil. We have a lot of oil rigs and oil wells. So that's a good avenue for research, the effects of all of this on marine ecosystem and human health. Try to use some of these new approach methodologies. Okay? And then we have heavy metal exposure and its effect on bed effect. I think that was the other talk I listened to. Okay, so we have real challenges, but we do have real opportunities as well. So we should be able to make use of them. So what is the way forward? What do I recommend as a way forward? The first, if I may recommend, is that any vice chancellors here try to have more dedicated departments or advanced degree programs for toxicology. Revise course syllabus. Try to revise your course syllabus to have more toxicology courses. And in this, try to have courses that will use some of these new approaches, these advances in toxicology to teach your students. Get guest speakers that are really experts in these areas to provide big workshops, symposium, seminar, to be able to train your students in this. There are global exchange programs for early, mid, and late career. Professor Orisapa is a typical example. You can contact him. There are so many programs, student exchange programs, that you can get involved in. Fellowships like the Fulbright. Okay? There are so many online webinars, courses that you can do. I know the challenge for us next time. Okay, right there. I know the challenge for us is finances, but again, there are some free webinars, there are some free workshops that you can learn some of these techniques through those free workshops. So don't be deterred by the financial aspect of it. Okay. We can also make sure that we are conducting research that is impactful to our society. I am not fully in academia. Academia is a part-time thing for me. I teach as an adjunct professor at Howard. So I'm not under the publish or perish. Okay? But I know that is a drive for us as academicians. You either publish or you perish. So we just do the research and publish. What is the impact of that research? So let's try to conduct impactful research. Improve our research culture. Modernize toxicology by incorporating some of these new technologies. Pragmatic use of our research findings. Is that research finding going to help you in developing a new product? Is that research finding going to help you in promoting and protecting public health? Is that research finding going to help you to set a limit that above this limit, no child should be exposed to any pesticide residue on apples above that level. So we have to do research that's impactful. Information sharing and collaboration. So maybe networking with other researchers would help. Instead of trying to do your own research by yourself, maybe collaborating with other peers help. Train toxicologists in regulatory toxicology and risk assessment to promote and protect public health. Develop resources for collection of adverse events. You know, we are in COVID pandemic. I see a number of us are not wearing a mask. I am fully vaccinated, but I should be wearing my mask. It's the childhood. But I know that in the United States, we have a lot of vaccine hesitance from the black community. I don't know about Nigeria, I don't know if it's the same thing. But maybe if your NAFDAC has what we call a vaccine adverse event reporting system, I don't know if they have that, where people can report adverse events when you take the vaccine. Maybe that could make you feel better about taking the vaccine. If I take the vaccine and I have high fever, I can let NAFDAC know, okay, and that will help them to build a risk profile for the vaccine. So that's something they should be thinking about. What about developing an adverse event reporting system for drugs, for dietary, for foods? So those are things you should be thinking about. Poison control centers. Okay, so those are all, one slide back. Okay, you're right. So those are all things we should be thinking about for the way forward. Next slide. So what are some of the resources that we can leverage? There are a number of international professional societies. Society of Toxicology has a global presence. So if you're here, I think it would be good to try to have a membership. I know their fees are a little high, but last year, Professor Aina Adiegun, she was past president, immediate past president of Toxicologists of African Origin, which is a special interest group under SCOT. She was able to make it possible for students and from developing countries to have it at a reduced rate. So there are opportunities that you can become a member, attend meetings, but also try to submit abstracts. Try to apply for travel awards. So that can make you come over and you get to learn some of these new technologies. Okay. Next slide, please. I already talked about the SCOT Global Senior Exchange Program. There's also the Toxicology Education Foundation. I'm a board member of that foundation. Dr. Michael Dockford is the president. There's a lot of information, educational on that website. It's called Toxicology Education Foundation. It's more environmental than cool. So if you're interested in environmental, you can go to that website and get more education for yourself. And then IUTOX, which is the umbrella of so many toxicology associations. They have a lot of CE courses, workshops, webinars that you can attend. Again, I know finances might be a cost, but you might be lucky to find a free one or at a reduced cost. And then you have Toxicology, Health Excellence for Risk Assessment, again by Dr. Michael Dawson. He goes to, I think, South Africa, Ghana, I think he's been to Nigeria to conduct training on risk assessment. So if you can get somebody like that to train more people on risk assessment, that would be wonderful. And then you have so many resources for those who are clinical toxicologists and forensic toxicologists. Next slide, please. So, like I said before, the future of toxicology, we must embrace as African toxicologists. We must embrace the future, otherwise we would be left behind. For sure, there are challenges, but again, there are real opportunities for us to move us forward. We should try as much as possible to leverage the resources that we have to be able to move forward. Next slide, please. I'll leave you with these two quotes. Where there is a will, there is a way. Where there is a will, there is a way. But you know, you can also have a will, but then you don't do anything. So that takes me to my next quote by Von Gogh, which says, knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do. So we have attended West African Society of Toxicology 10th anniversary. We've had this meeting. People have shared so much information. I have shared my own information with you. Do not take this information and sit on it. Take it, apply it, use it, do something with it. Only then can you make a difference as toxicologists. Thank you so much for your time. So these are my acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge WASOT, all the officers and the organizers, Professor Orish, who actually nominated me to the WASOT organizers, Professor Ipezo. I haven't met him, that's you. Oh my gosh. The president, thank you. And of course, Professor Akore that I've been communicating, who picked me up from the airport, constantly worrying him about changing this or changing that. So thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure meeting you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, more round of applause.